This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions by which energy is released in individual cells. It is called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in your high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence whenever to anything important in his life as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing. Not the same quote, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children, but sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
It is commonly believed in the United States that school is where people go to get an education. Nevertheless, it has been said that today, children interrupt their education to go to school. The distinction between schooling and education implied by this remark is important. Education is much more open-ended and all-inclusive than schooling. Education knows no bounds. It can take place anywhere, whether in the shower or in the job, whether in the kitchen or on a tractor. It includes both the formal learning that takes place in schools and the whole universe of informal learning. The agents of education can range from a revered grandparent to the people debating politics on the radio, from a child to a distinguished scientist. Whereas schooling has a certain predictability, education quite often produces surprises. A chance conversation with a stranger may lead a person to discover how little is known of other religions. People are engaged in education from infancy on. Education, then, is a very broad, inclusive term. It is a lifelong process, a process that starts long before the start of school, and one that should be an integral part of one's entire life. Schooling, on the other hand, is a specific, formalized process whose general pattern varies little from one setting to the next. Throughout the country, children arrive at school at approximately the same time, take assigned seats, are taught by an adult, use similar textbooks, do homework, take exams, and so on. The slices of reality that are to be learned, whether they are the alphabet or an understanding of the workings of government, have usually been limited by the boundaries of the subject being taught. For example, high school students know that they are not likely to find out in their classes the truth about political problems in their communities or what the newest filmmakers are experimenting with. There are definite conditions surrounding the formalized process of schooling.
Current studies show that what goes on labels is an important consideration for manufacturers, since more than 70% of shoppers read food labels when considering whether to buy a product. A recent controversy as to whether labels on prepared foods should educate or merely inform the consumer is over, and a consumer group got its way. The group had maintained that product labels should do more than simply list how many grams of nutrients a food contains. Their contention was that labels should also list the percentage of a day's total nutrients that the product will supply to the consumer, because this information is essential in planning a healthy diet. A government agency disagreed strongly, favoring a label that merely informs the consumer. In other words, a label that only lists the contents of the product. The agency maintained that consumers could decide for themselves if the food is nutritious and is meeting their daily needs. The consumer group, in supporting its case, had cited a survey in which shoppers were shown a food label and were then asked if they would need more or less of a certain nutrient after eating a serving of this product. The shoppers weren't able to answer the questions easily when they were not given a specific percentage. This study and others helped get the new regulation passed, and now food products must have the more detailed labels.
And so this is one picture that probably you all know what it is when you see it. It's a familiar looking image. It's something that probably we all have some personal experience with, right? This is a chest X-ray that would be taken in your doctor's office, for example, or a radiologist's office. And it is a good example of biomedical engineering in that it takes a physical principle, that is, how do X-rays interact with the tissues of your body, and it uses that physics, that physical principle, to develop a picture of what's inside your body. So to look inside and see things that you couldn't see without this device. And you'll recognize some of the parts of the image. You can see the rib cage here, the bones. You can see the heart is this large, bright object down here. If you're have good eyesight from the distance that you're at, you can see the vessels leading out of the heart and into the lungs, and the lungs are these darker spaces within the rib cage.
A wind turbine is a device that will convert wind into mechanical movement, which we can use to power a water pump or electricity generator. Now, the power that a turbine creates is obviously dependent on the wind speed, but it's also dependent obviously on the number of sails, the area of the sails, and the angle that the sails makes to the wind. So if you can imagine, if the turbine blades are flat onto the wind is just going to sort of bend it. But if they're at a slight angle, when the wind hits it, it's going to turn the blades. And we can use that for powering things. Now we're going to have a go at making some very, very simple paper windmills, the sort of things that you can make from the bits and pieces lying around at home, and use that to drive a very small generator to power electronic devices.
I need to make sure you understand how to get housing for next year. When you entered as first-year students this year, the school assigned you to a dorm and a roommate. But next year, as returning students, you'll choose both your roommate and your dorm. But whether or not you actually get to live in your first choice depends on what number you or your roommate draws in the lottery system. The system gives priority to the students who have been here longest. Fourth-year students get the first block of numbers. Third years get the second block, and second years, like you'll be, get the third. The lower the number you draw, the sooner you choose. Number 1 gets the first choice. Number 2 gets the second choice, and so on. You can use either your own or your intended roommate's number to make your room choice. If your roommate for next year has been at the school longer than you have, they'll be in a better block of numbers, and so will have a better number than any second-year student. But most of you will probably be rooming with other second-year students, and so neither of you may have a great number. You may not get into your first or even second choice. Of course, if you've made plans to live off campus, you don't need to enter the lottery at all. Dorm space will be especially tight this year because the dorms on North Campus will be closed for renovations. This means that those of you who draw the worst numbers won't be able to get dorm housing at all. In that case, the housing office will help you find off-campus housing.
From reading philosophy, I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city. The principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted. To say, well, we have to make our city more competitive because sometime in the by and by, the benefits will trickle down to those people who are worst off. Doesn't justify making them worst off at the time. We have a lot of examples in the world of people whose homes were destroyed in the name of the greater good and said, well, eventually they will benefit. But equity means that you do not, in fact, take advantage of those people who are weakest.
Okay, to help you with your research, I just wanted to give you some tips today on using focus groups. These are groups of people that you get together to find out about their opinions and attitudes, for example, to review a piece of work, or just basically provide some collective input to help you with whatever you're researching. First of all, how large should a focus group be? Well, I would say that an ideal number of participants is around 6 or 7. If it's any bigger, what quite often happens is they break into side conversations and the focus is lost. If it's any smaller, you may not get the range of views that you need to get a really good discussion. Secondly, it's important that you have a moderator for the group who's able to facilitate and guide the discussions. The moderator must ensure that everyone participates and stop anyone dominating. And also, the moderator needs to make sure that the discussions don't go off in the wrong direction. And thirdly, in order to help the group focus on what's required, some basic materials should be used, particularly to kick-start the discussions. This may be in the form of pictures, photos, diagrams, graphs, etc., and will help the group to understand the context of what needs to be discussed.
Community service is an important component of education here at our university. We encourage all students to volunteer for at least one community activity before they graduate. A new community program called One-on-One helps elementary students who've fallen behind. You education majors might be especially interested in it because it offers the opportunity to do some teaching, that is, tutoring in math and English. You'd have to volunteer 2 hours a week for one semester. You can choose to help a child with math, English, or both. Half-hour lessons are fine, so you could do half-hour of each subject, 2 days a week. Professor Dodge will act as a mentor to these tutors. He'll be available to help you with the lesson plans or to offer suggestions for activities. He has office hours every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. You can sign up for the program with him and begin the tutoring next week. I'm sure you'll enjoy this community service and you'll gain valuable experience at the same time. It looks good on your resume too, showing that you've had experience with children and that you care about your community. If you'd like to sign up or have any questions, stop by Professor Dodge's office this week.
The American people are fed up with partisan politics. In a recent Gallup poll, Americans named dissatisfaction with government as the #1 problem facing the country today. Americans now believe our government is more of a problem than the economy, education, and terrorism. To change the way our elected officials work for the American people, we must change how they are elected. We need to start with the first round of voting, the primaries. Thanks to gerrymandering and other factors, the primary election is often the only election that matters. In many states, less than 5% of the electorate are actually deciding who represents 100% of that district or state. That means our elected officials are actually chosen by an increasingly tiny, often incredibly partisan slice of the electorate. Today, 42% of Americans identify themselves as independents. Most states exclude independent voters from voting in the first round, the primaries. And in states that do allow them to vote in primaries, they are forced to temporarily join a party that they don't believe in. A top 2 nonpartisan primary eliminates party control in favor of a single nonpartisan primary open to all voters and all candidates. There is no longer a Democratic primary and a Republican primary. There is one primary open to all voters and all candidates. The top 2 vote-getters, regardless of party, then move forward to the general election. With nonpartisan primaries, everyone gets to vote. The winners are more accountable because they have to speak to all the voters in order to get elected. Elections are more competitive. Legislators are encouraged to work across party lines and focus on issues we care about. Top 2 nonpartisan primaries are now used in California, Nebraska, and Washington. You've probably already voted using top 2. Most municipal elections nationwide use this simple, nonpartisan system. Today, activists in all 50 states are working to bring this crucial system change to their state. The movement is growing. Join us and help us create a government that truly is by and for the people.
The Earth's temperature is rising, and as it does, springtime phenomena, like the first bloom of flowers, are getting earlier and earlier. But rising temperatures aren't the only factor. Urban light pollution is also quickening the coming of spring.
So temperature and light are really contributing to a double whammy of making everything earlier.
Richard French-Constant, an entomologist at the University of Exeter. He and his colleagues compiled 13 years of data from citizen scientists in the UK who tracked the first bud burst of 4 common trees. And it turns out light pollution from street lights in cities and along roads pushed bud burst a full week earlier, way beyond what rising temperatures could achieve. This disruptive timing can ripple through the ecosystem.
The caterpillars that feed on trees are trying to match the hatching of their eggs to the timing of bud burst, because the caterpillars want to feed on the juiciest and least chemically protected leaves. And it's not just the caterpillars, of course, that are important, but the knock-on effect is on nesting birds, which are also trying to hatch their chicks at the same time that there's the maximum number of caterpillars.
So earlier buds could ultimately affect the survival of birds and beyond. The findings are in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B.
Now, as urban planners, what we really need to start considering is the amount of space allocated for residential areas within a city or town. And when I say space, I'm talking about space within a dwelling or home, rather than the actual size of residential areas. There's growing concern that the internal space of new homes is becoming far smaller, too small, in fact. Maybe you're thinking, is it important for residents to have sufficient space? Is it merely a preference to have more space, or are there more serious implications? Is there, in fact, any evidence to suggest cramped living conditions affect residents' physical or mental well-being or their day-to-day life? Well, research from a number of sources indicates that this is an important issue which needs addressing. Cramped conditions can lead to aggressive behaviour, to family tensions, psychological anguish, and, in the more extreme cases, physical illness as well. Not only this, but there is a proven link between overcrowding and the social and emotional development of children, as well as their educational attainment. So, the main issue here is that residents require enough individual space to be able to live and function together, but with sufficient private space for personal time within the home.
Supersymmetry is a mathematical idea that people have developed in effort to understand the sharpest organizing principle for the fundamental constituents of matter. You see, we have learned that particles that seem to be different can actually secretly be united by certain symmetry principles. So we're used to the fact that there are symmetric objects in the world like a sphere or a basketball. You turn a sphere, and even though you've transformed it, it looks the same, fundamentally. We found that certain particles, when you transform one particle into another, even though it looks like the identity of the particle has changed, overall the equations describing it, they don't change at all, an underlying level of symmetry. But what we've not been able to do is find a symmetry that would relate certain kinds of particles, namely matter particles and force particles. Matter particles are particles like electrons and muons, quarks. Force particles are like photons and gluons and WZ bosons. Supersymmetry is a symmetry that actually relates these two kinds, these two classes of particles. And people have proven that supersymmetry is the last possible symmetry of the fundamental particles that our mathematics, reality, has not yet been shown to make use of. So people are now trying to see whether that symmetry might actually be at work in the world. Can we find evidence for it in our understanding of the fundamental particles?
So today we're going to talk about children's literature and the role it plays in society. Throughout history, adults have used the power of stories to entertain and amuse their children. But stories are not used merely to entertain youngsters. They have a significant educational purpose. They serve to teach the moral values of their society. In sociological terms, stories are one of the means by which children are socialized. How does this work in practice? Well, it often makes use of heroes, the characters in the stories who the children will admire and want to be like. The heroes of children's stories, therefore, exemplify the qualities valued by that society. They will typically demonstrate courage in the face of difficulty, honesty, consideration for others, loyalty to their family and friends, a respect for work, and so on. You can see this happening from the fables of ancient societies, through fairy tales and folk tales, right up to modern-day children's stories. For example, the hard-working ant in Aesop's fable is shown to succeed in comparison with the grasshopper, who spends the summer singing and has nothing to eat when winter comes. Similarly, it is Cinderella, the honest, hard-working sister, who wins the prince rather than her cruel, lazy stepsisters. However, there is still usually something to entertain children, even in the most morally instructive of stories.
Thank you.